if you pull up a map of the world right now and zoom in on the Middle East, it is remarkably easy to completely overlook the Strait of Hormuz.
Oh, absolutely. It just blends right in.
Yeah, it's just this tiny, unassuming sliver of blue water sitting between Iran and Oman. But, I mean, if you had to pinpoint the single most concentrated, high-stakes pressure point in the entire architecture of the global economy, you would draw a circle right around that little sliver of water.
Because it is a total geographic anomaly. I mean, when you look at the sheer volume of global energy that relies on that specific, very narrow corridor,
Right.
its strategic density basically dictates the terms of modern international trade in a way that very few physical locations on Earth do.
And unpacking that quiet, massive shift happening around that specific choke point is exactly what we are doing today. Welcome to this deep dive.
Glad to be here, as always.
So our source material today is a really fascinating translation of a video transcript. It's from the YouTube channel Profession Perspectiva.
And the title is the Dollar Ending? The $100 B plan to bypass the Strait of Hormuz explained.
Exactly. And the mission for our deep dive today is to explore this $100 billion global infrastructure strategy that is operating almost entirely under the radar.
Yeah, the source basically argues that this massive global effort isn't just about, finding new logistical routes to move oil around.
Right, it's much bigger than that.
It is a deliberate, methodical campaign to dismantle the 50-year hegemony of the U.S. dollar.
Which is a huge claim. And real quick, we should state right up front, this deep dive explores geopolitics and global finance based strictly on the provided source.
Yeah.
We are not taking political sides here, left or right.
No, not at all. We're just looking at the structural chessboard they've laid out. Regardless of where you sit politically, the mechanics they outline about global finance are just, well, they're impossible to ignore.
Our goal is simply to impartially convey these strategic shifts. So you might be wondering why you should care about a series of pipelines being constructed like thousands of miles away.
Right. It sounds a bit removed from daily life.
But the reality is that this slow tectonic shift will eventually dictate the resilience of the supply chains we all rely on. It impacts global inflation and, honestly, the underlying purchasing power of the money sitting in your bank account right now.
Because it's all connected.
Exactly. Okay, let's unpack this. Think of the global economy like a massive game of Monopoly, where one player just happens to own all the railroads and the bank.
Which is a pretty sweet setup for that player.
Yeah. But what happens to the game when the other players quietly start building their own board?
I love that analogy. It's like building an entirely parallel internet. Imagine a coalition of users laying down their own physical fiber optic cables across the globe, just so they never again have to route their data through a server controlled by a single dominant tech company.
That parallel internet concept frames this perfectly. But before we look at the new cables being laid, we have to look at the server everyone is trying to bypass.
Right, the bottleneck itself.
Yeah, because in geopolitics, geography dictates strategy. So let's talk about the physical reality of that 33-kilometer bottleneck at Hormuz.
33 kilometers at its narrowest point, which is, frankly, a stunningly narrow gap for any major commercial vessel, let alone the entire global energy supply.
Wait, 33 kilometers, that's barely anything.
Barely anything. And through that tiny gap, between 17 and 20 million barrels of oil pass every single day.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, that represents roughly 20% of the entire world's daily oil consumption. The source describes it with a phrase that really stuck out to me. They call it a bottleneck disguised as a maritime route.
A bottleneck disguised as a maritime route. That's good. The vulnerability of that is just staggering, though.
Oh, absolutely. The source points out that if the Strait of Hormuz were to be closed or blocked, even for just a brief, temporary period, the resulting shock wouldn't just be a spike in oil prices at the pump.
Right, it would be a cascading failure across the global economy. Manufacturing grinds to a halt, transport costs multiply overnight, inflation surges.
But the vulnerability goes much deeper than the physical commodity. The physical choke point of Hormuz is the anchor for a massive financial choke point.
Which brings us to the petrodollar system.
Exactly. For decades, the United States has essentially served as the ultimate guarantor of security for these specific maritime routes.
Right, through unmatched naval power, the U.S. ensures that the oil just keeps flowing out of the Persian Gulf.
And in exchange for that physical security, a very specific economic reality was cemented. Oil is exclusively negotiated, priced, and traded in U.S. dollars.
But wait, I have to ask a pushback question here. We always hear about the fragility of global supply chains, but isn't 33 kilometers essentially the width of a medium-sized city?
Pretty much.
How did the entire modern global economy allow itself to balance on something so incredibly tiny and vulnerable?
Well, it was incredibly efficient at the time. The system evolved primarily around military efficiency and post-WWII architecture rather than, diverse risk management.
Jeez.
Exactly. It was easy to load massive supertankers in the Persian Gulf and sail them out under the protective umbrella of the U.S. Navy. The geographic choke point organically sustained the financial choke point.
But let's look at the actual mechanics of what the petrodollar means. Because it's not just a matter of quoting a price in a certain currency.
No, it's about the financial plumbing. If a nation needs oil to keep its economy functioning, it literally has to acquire dollars to pay for it.
And when international transactions are settled in dollars, they ultimately have to clear through a U.S. correspondent bank.
Right. So even if a country in Asia is buying oil from a country in the Middle East, the financial data of that transaction flows right through the U.S. banking system.
Meaning Washington gets total visibility and, crucially, legal jurisdiction over the trade.
Which provides incredible leverage. The ability to enforce global sanctions, to isolate a country economically, or to freeze assets, it all relies entirely on the fact that the world simply has no choice but to use the dollar.
To secure its energy needs. Right. So the central thesis of our source material is that nations have finally realized a hard truth. To escape the financial grip of the dollar, you first have to escape the physical geography of the Strait of Hormuz.
Yes, you have to break the physical bottleneck to break the financial one, which moves us from the abstract world of global finance directly into the physical hardware.
The concrete and steel being poured right now.
Exactly. The source outlines this $100 billion infrastructure movement.
But it's not some monolithic mega project directed by a single authority, is it?
Not at all. It is a highly sophisticated, decentralized network of sovereign investments. And the primary objective of every single one of these projects is to methodically reduce dependency on that one 33-kilometer gap.
Here's where it gets really interesting. It's like building a secret back door to your own house, so you no longer have to walk past the heavily armed bouncer standing at your front door.
That is exactly what they're doing, and the actors involved in this are particularly revealing. Like Saudi Arabia is perhaps the most glaring example.
Because their oil fields are mostly in the east, right?
Right, adjacent to the Persian Gulf. Historically, extracting that oil meant putting it on a tanker in the Gulf, which inherently meant sailing it right through Hormuz.
They were physically captive to the bottleneck.
Yes. If you are sitting in Riyadh and your entire economic lifeblood is trapped inside the Persian Gulf, you really only have one strategic move to regain your sovereignty.
You have to pipe the oil west.
Which is exactly the function of the East-West pipeline. The source highlights this as an underestimated but absolutely crucial asset. Saudi Arabia built a massive pipeline stretching roughly 1,200 kilometers directly across the Arabian Peninsula.
Wow. Straight to the Red Sea.
Straight to the industrial city of Yanbu on the coast of the Red Sea, completely bypassing the Strait of Hormuz.
And gaining direct access to the Suez Canal and European markets. So by establishing that route, they transform a severe geographic limitation into a strategic option.
Exactly. And the United Arab Emirates is executing the exact same playbook. They built the Habshan-Fujairah pipeline.
So that takes crude from Abu Dhabi and pumps it where?
Directly to the port of Fujairah. And the critical detail here is the geography. Fujairah sits on the Gulf of Oman, which is firmly outside the Strait of Hormuz.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
So the oil flows directly into the open waters of the Indian Ocean.
Right. Now, the source points out an interesting economic reality here. Overland pipelines are often significantly more expensive to operate per barrel than simply loading a supertanker at the source.
But they're doing it anyway.
Because the objective isn't to make the logistics cheaper, the objective is strategic autonomy. The message is that depending on a single maritime corridor is simply an unacceptable national security risk.
What makes this so compelling is that Saudi Arabia and the UAE are traditional security partners of the United States. They're spending billions to insulate themselves.
Right.
But when you apply this same lens to U.S. rivals, a much larger, cohesive global pattern emerges.
The scale shifts dramatically when you bring China into the analysis. China is the world's largest energy importer.
So they must be terrified of vulnerable maritime routes.
Absolutely. When Beijing looks at the map, they see Hormuz and the Strait of Malacca as existential threats. The source frames this as a core vulnerability. In a severe geopolitical crisis, those choke points could easily be blockaded by a dominant naval power.
Effectively starving the Chinese economy of energy overnight.
Exactly. So China's response is the Belt and Road Initiative. We often hear Belt and Road discussed as just, a massive infrastructure spending program.
Yeah, building roads and bridges everywhere.
But the source explicitly argues we should view it as a deliberate reconfiguration of global energy flows. They are financing and building deep-water ports and overland corridors.
Like the one in Pakistan, right?
Yes, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. It links the port of Gwadar in Pakistan directly overland into western China. They are systematically constructing an overland energy grid that physically sidesteps vulnerable maritime choke points.
Yeah, Iran is doing this too. I mean, they're heavily sanctioned and acutely aware of the risks, even though they technically control their side of the strait.
Right. They are actively developing the Jask export terminal on the Gulf of Oman to ensure their oil can reach international waters without having to navigate Hormuz.
So you look at the entire map, the Saudi East-West pipeline, the UAE's Fujairah bypass, China's overland Asian corridors, Iran's alternative terminals. The source identifies a phenomenon it calls strategic convergence.
It is a vital concept for understanding the current geopolitical landscape. There is no formal treaty binding all these nations together into a single alliance.
They aren't sitting in a smoke-filled room drafting a shared master plan.
No, not at all. But their individual national security priorities are overlapping perfectly. The aggregate result is a highly coordinated global insurance policy against the vulnerabilities of the post-WWII order.
And this brings us right back to the parallel internet analogy. The physical pipelines directly enable the shift in global finance.
Exactly.
Think about it like a toll road. Imagine if the toll road you have to take to work every day suddenly had 3 brand new, completely free alternate routes.
You'd stop paying the toll, right?
I definitely would. So what happens to the guy running the toll booth? If the commodity no longer relies on the physical protection of the U.S. Navy to reach its destination, then the transaction no longer inherently requires the U.S. dollar to facilitate it.
That linkage is everything. The source actually uses their exact highway and toll booth analogy. Bypassing Hormuz isn't just about rerouting oil. It is about deliberately rerouting financial power. The foundations of the dollar's dominance were built on necessity.
Right.
When that necessity erodes, the structural integrity of the global reserve currency begins to fracture.
So to understand how that fracture is happening, we need to look at what actually holds the dollar up. The source breaks the dollar's dominance down into 3 load-bearing pillars.
Trust, liquidity, and military force.
Right. If you think about why the dollar has survived as the global reserve currency for so long, it's really a combination of sheer convenience and deep-seated institutional reliability.
The liquidity aspect cannot be overstated. The dollar is the frictionless lubricant of international trade. It is the most universally accepted, easily accessible medium of exchange on the planet.
So if you are conducting massive, multi-billion-dollar transactions across different continents, using dollars ensures the trade happens smoothly and instantly.
Exactly. Then there is the pillar of trust. Historically, the U.S. legal framework, its institutional stability, and its consistent adherence to financial commitments made the dollar the ultimate safe haven.
Global central banks felt secure parking their national wealth in U.S. Treasury bonds because the system was viewed as a stable, neutral utility.
And the third pillar, military force, ensured the physical transit of goods that backed the entire system.
But what the source argues is that all 3 of these pillars are currently buckling. And the catalyst for that stress isn't a military conflict, is it?
No, it is the weaponization of the financial system itself. Over the last decade, and accelerating recently, the U.S. has increasingly utilized the dollar network to enforce unilateral sanctions.
Like freezing foreign exchange reserves.
Yes. When Washington decides to freeze the reserves of a sovereign nation's central bank, effectively locking them out of their own national wealth because it is held in dollars, the perception of the currency fundamentally changes.
The trust fractures. Suddenly, the dollar is no longer perceived as a neutral piece of global infrastructure.
Exactly. It is perceived as a strategic weapon that can be activated at any moment. So for nations observing this, holding all of their wealth in a system controlled by a single government becomes an unacceptable risk.
So just like they built alternative pipelines to bypass Hormuz, they start building alternative financial mechanisms to bypass the dollar.
Yes, the financial bypasses are being built as we speak.
But how does that actually work mechanically? We always hear the buzzword de-dollarization in the news, but the actual plumbing of how countries trade without the dollar is rarely explained.
Well, we are seeing it happen through several distinct mechanisms. First is the direct settlement of commodities in alternative currencies, particularly the Chinese yuan. We are seeing major energy contracts being negotiated where the buyer just pays in yuan rather than dollars. Second, and perhaps more structurally significant, is the rise of bilateral currency swaps.
Right, where two central banks agree to exchange their local currencies directly.
Precisely. Instead of India converting rupees into dollars and then converting those dollars into rubles to buy Russian oil, which requires the transaction to pass through the U.S. banking system.
And gives Washington jurisdiction.
Right. Instead of doing that, the central banks of India and Russia establish a direct exchange rate. They swap their currencies directly, settling the trade entirely outside the SWIFT network.
Completely off the radar.
Exactly. We are also seeing the development of new digital currency platforms designed specifically for cross-border trade.
Using digital ledgers to bypass traditional clearinghouses.
Yep. And as the dependency on U.S. protected maritime routes decreases because of the new pipelines, that third pillar, the necessity of U.S. military protection, also weakens.
So what does this all mean? Because, wait, changing the global reserve currency sounds like a massive, chaotic, world-ending event.
It sounds like panic.
Right? Yeah. Wall Street should be in an absolute panic, and it should be the leading story on every financial network every single day. Yet the source specifically says this shift is almost invisible. How can something so historically huge be invisible?
Because the countries involved understand that a sudden, violent break from the dollar would be catastrophic for their own economies.
Oh, because they still hold massive reserves of U.S. debt.
Exactly. Their current trade relies on dollar liquidity. The source addresses this exact paradox using the analogy of tectonic plates.
Tectonic plates beneath the surface.
Yes. Tectonic plates carry the weight of entire continents. When they shift, they alter the physical geography of the planet. But the movement is incredibly slow, deep underground.
You don't feel them moving on a random Tuesday.
Right. You only notice the tension when a major earthquake hits. What we are witnessing is a managed, pragmatic evolution. These nations are not burning their dollars overnight.
They are methodically diversifying.
Exactly. They finance a port here, establish a local currency swap there, settle a fraction of their oil trade in yuan. Day by day, it doesn't generate a headline that panics Wall Street, but decade by decade, it entirely transforms the foundation of the global economy.
It is a structural paradigm shift playing out in slow motion. When we look at the totality of what the source has laid out, the core takeaway is profound.
It really is.
The $100 billion being deployed to lay pipelines across deserts and carve out new deepwater ports isn't just an infrastructure upgrade. It is a physical declaration.
The world is systematically engineering a reality where it no longer has to rely on a single 33-kilometer choke point.
And simultaneously, no longer relies on a single financial system. We are observing the gradual birth of a complex, multipolar world.
The era of a unipolar global economy, heavily anchored by the U.S. dollar and American naval supremacy, is making room for a highly fragmented set of regional networks.
So the next time you are scanning the news and you see a seemingly dry, boring headline about a new pipeline opening in Central Asia or a bilateral trade agreement signed in local currencies, you will know the actual context.
You'll know the secret.
Yeah. You aren't just reading about logistics or minor trade deals. You are watching the foundational rules of global power being rewritten in real time, brick by brick.
Which leaves us with a critical, lingering question to consider as this transition accelerates. For the last half-century, the global system had a definitive anchor.
The U.S. dollar and military?
Right. There was a single, dominant financial center capable of absorbing global shocks, enforcing international trade rules, and acting as the ultimate guarantor of commercial security.
So if that monopoly permanently fractures,
if energy trade diffuses across multiple currencies and physical trade disperses across decentralized sovereign routes, what happens to international stability? When there is no single dominant power capable of enforcing sanctions or acting as the central policeman of international commerce who steps in to police these new secondary roads of the global economy.
Or maybe the entire concept of a singular global policeman simply becomes obsolete. If every region builds its own closed-loop infrastructure and every block runs its own financial server, maybe the era of anyone running the global bank is just permanently over. It is a staggering structural shift to keep your eyes on. Thank you for joining us, and we will catch you on the next Deep Dive.